It began on a dry evening when the air itself seemed ready to ignite. For a week the valley had held its breath. No rain, no dew, only the steady hum of heat trapped beneath a sky the color of copper. At the edge of the county, surrounded by miles of pine and brush, stood the Miller family's small wooden home. They had lived there for years, close to the forest, trusting its quiet. That night the quiet betrayed them. It started as a whisper, a faint crackle carried by the wind, the kind that usually dies before you notice. But this one grew. Within minutes, the treetops glowed red, and the forest itself seemed to breathe fire. The flames moved faster than any storm, leaping from branch to branch, turning dry needles into sparks that rained down on the roof. The father shouted for his wife to grab their son, Evan, only 10 years old and already out of bed, drawn by the strange orange light flickering against his window. The air filled with the sharp sting of smoke as the house began to tremble from the heat. By the time the father reached the front door, the fire had already wrapped around the porch like a living thing. The mother pulled at the boy's arm, but the window shattered and a wall of light swallowed the room. For a moment, the world vanished in color and sound, the roar of the blaze louder than any voice. When the father broke through the side door, coughing and half-blind, his wife stumbled out behind him, covered in soot, screaming Evan's name. The boy was gone, lost somewhere inside the swirling black and red haze. The forest around them had turned into a wall of moving light. Sparks drifted through the air like burning snow. The father ran toward the back of the house, shouting, choking, searching for any sign of his son's voice. But the only sound was the fire's relentless roar and the crack of timber breaking apart. Behind him, his wife fell to her knees, the sky glowing crimson above her. Then, through the smoke, something moved. It was quick, a dark outline against the inferno, massive and upright, walking through the fire as though the flames parted around it. At first, the father thought it was one of the firefighters, though they hadn't arrived yet. But this shape was wrong, too broad in the shoulders, too heavy in the gait. It stepped through the doorway, where moments earlier the boy had disappeared and vanished into the blaze. The seconds dragged on like hours. The mother screamed again, but her voice broke into silence when the figure reappeared. It emerged from the fire, enormous and half-covered in soot, carrying something in its arms. The boy, his small body limp but whole, his face pressed against the creature's chest. The being moved with purpose, unbothered by the heat, its dark fur shining wet under the reflection of the flames. It crossed the yard in long, powerful strides and stopped near the edge of the forest. For a moment it looked back. The father would later swear that their eyes met through the haze, one man and something far older, connected in an instant of terrible understanding. Then, without a sound, the creature laid the boy on the grass, turned, and vanished into the burning trees. The sound of cracking wood swallowed everything. When the firefighters arrived, the Miller's home was already gone, reduced to glowing embers. They found the boy unconscious, but alive, his face streaked with ash, his small hands clenched tight. The mother covered him with her jacket, trembling as she whispered that someone had brought him out, someone tall, someone not human. And though no one could explain it, the cameras could. When the fire had finally been tamed and the last embers hissed into silence, the firefighters combed through what remained of the Miller home. Charred beams lay twisted like the bones of something ancient, and the smell of wet ash clung to the air long after the smoke had thinned. Among the ruins, one of the men found a small metallic box, half melted but still intact. The front porch security camera, its glass lens cracked, but the internal drive miraculously untouched. It was taken back to the station, more out of routine than hope. No one expected it to contain anything but static and flickering shadows. Yet, when they connected it to the monitor, what appeared on the screen silenced the room. The footage began with chaos, the storm of sparks flying past the camera, the frame shaking as heat distorted the air. The screen bled red and orange as the fire swallowed the walls, and through the haze, faint figures could be seen. The parent stumbling into view, shouting words that the crackling audio refused to carry. Then came a tremor, a moment when the picture warped, as if the lens itself had flinched. Out of the smoke, a shape moved against the tide of flames. It wasn't running or crawling, but walking, pushing through the blinding light like it belonged there. At first, the men thought it must have been a firefighter in heavy gear, but something about the motion was wrong. Too smooth, too deliberate, too fearless for a man surrounded by fire. The figure was enormous, towering well above the doorframe it passed through, its outline broad and unmistakably upright. The camera struggled to focus, but for a few seconds the light fell just right, and the image sharpened. The body wasn't covered in any recognizable uniform. Instead, it glistened with what looked like soaked fur, dark and matted, reflecting flashes of flame like strands of molten glass. The head turned once toward the lens, and a faint reflection caught in what could only have been eyes, deep-set, amber in color, and frighteningly calm. The creature didn't hesitate. It stepped fully into the house, disappearing into the inferno that had already consumed most of the living room. The screen went white, then black for several long seconds. The firefighters watching the footage could hear their own breathing over the hum of the playback equipment. Then, suddenly, movement returned. Out of the blur and heat shimmer, the same towering figure emerged again, this time cradling a small body against its chest. Through the distortion, the outline of the child was clear, arms limp, head resting against the creature's forearm, his clothes smoldering but intact. The being shielded him completely, its massive frame cutting through the storm of ash. The camera caught the moment it crossed what was left of the porch. The wind tore at the flames, blowing smoke in every direction, yet the creature walked steadily, each step measured and unhurried, as if guided by purpose rather than panic. The child's face briefly turned toward the lens, soot-streaked but untouched by the chaos raging behind him. Then, just before the image blurred into static, the creature's silhouette passed the edge of the yard and vanished into the darkness where the forest began. The firefighters replayed the clip again and again, looking for seams, reflections, tricks of light, anything that could turn the impossible into something ordinary. But every time, the same thing stared back at them, a figure that did not belong to man or myth, walking through fire to save a child, and leaving behind only a trail of disbelief and silence. At first, the firefighters dismissed what they had seen as an illusion born from exhaustion and chaos, a simple trick of light, smoke, and adrenaline. The official report even stated that the figure was most likely a first responder in a heat-resistant suit, perhaps someone who had arrived before the main team. But when the footage was later sent to the forensic analysis unit in Helena, the story began to unravel. The technicians enhanced the frames, slowed the motion, and adjusted the color balance to filter out the distortion caused by the heat waves. What appeared then on the monitor made even the most skeptical among them fall silent. The so-called suit, which they assumed to be made of synthetic fiber or protective foil, showed no signs of seams, clasps, or reflective tape. Instead, the magnified image revealed a texture that was rough, uneven, and organic. The strands covering the figure were not fabric at all, but dense, coarse hair, each fiber catching the light from the fire in subtle shades of bronze and black. The more the footage was sharpened, the more the illusion of human form collapsed. The skin beneath the fur appeared thick, leathery, and unburned, untouched by heat that had turned steel beams into warped ribbons. The movement analysis was what convinced them this was no man in costume. When broken down frame by frame, the figure's posture and gait defied every expectation of human biomechanics. The stride length was nearly twice that of an adult male, and yet each step landed with a precision that looked almost weightless. Its balance was uncanny. The torso remained perfectly level, while the legs absorbed the motion, moving with a natural rhythm more like an animal built for mountain terrain than a human body fighting gravity. Even the arm motion didn't match any known human pattern. The swing was longer, the shoulders set wider apart, the reach of the hands extending far beyond normal anatomical proportion. In one frame, as the creature turned slightly, the analysts noted the expansion of the ribcage, wide, deep, almost barrel-shaped, supporting a mass that could not belong to anyone of ordinary size. There was no oxygen tank, no breathing apparatus, and yet the creature moved calmly through the flames, the firelight dancing off wet strands of fur as though it had stepped out of some prehistoric world. Several experts from the State University's anthropology department were brought in to review the footage. One of them, a specialist in comparative anatomy, spoke quietly after watching it in slow motion. This isn't a man pretending to be something else. It's something else pretending to be man. His words hung in the sterile room, their meaning sinking in slowly. As the days passed, the video spread through closed channels, local law enforcement, wildlife officers, university researchers, each group trying to explain what the firefighters had captured. Every theory eventually collided with the same immovable wall. The image was too real, too consistent, too detailed to dismiss. It was not a trick of smoke or faulty pixels. It was a being with mass, muscle, and motion, something massive and alive that had stepped willingly into fire and walked back out carrying a child. What unsettled everyone most was not just what they saw, but what they didn't. There was no indication of pain, no signs of distress, no hesitation in its movements. It acted with purpose, as though the inferno around it were irrelevant. The creature's composure, even as sparks rained down and timber collapsed, was what turned disbelief into quiet awe. Something had crossed the line between myth and evidence, and the men in that small dark room knew that once the world saw what they were seeing, nothing would ever look the same again. They found Evan lying on the frozen grass about 30 meters from what was left of the house, his small frame curled as if he'd simply fallen asleep in the middle of a storm. The paramedics rushed to him expecting the worst, smoke inhalation, severe burns, maybe worse. But what they discovered made no sense. His pulse was faint but steady, his breathing shallow, and despite being carried through a wall of fire, his body showed no major injuries. His skin was streaked with soot, his eyelashes clumped together from the heat, yet not a single patch of blistered flesh could be found. The boy's jacket was singed around the edges, but underneath it, his shirt was almost dry, as if something, or someone, had shielded him from the inferno. The medics exchanged confused glances as they checked him over, their faces illuminated by the glow of still-burning debris. The air reeked of smoke and melted plastic, and somewhere in the distance, a tree cracked under its own smoldering weight. One of the firefighters, his hands trembling, swore he saw a dark shape retreating toward the tree line, but when others turned, there was only the shimmer of heat above the snow. As the emergency team loaded Evan onto a stretcher, the mother stumbled forward, her eyes wide with disbelief and ash streaking her face. She clutched his hand and whispered his name again and again, as if saying it would keep him tethered to her. The father stood nearby, silent, staring past the lights of the ambulance toward the forest beyond, where the smoke turned to fog. He didn't speak when the paramedics asked questions. He just kept looking, his expression hollow and searching. On the ride to the hospital, Evan stirred. The medics leaned in, expecting confusion or panic, but when his eyes fluttered open, he was calm. His irises were glassy, reflecting the flicker of the siren lights as if they were still seeing the fire. His voice, when it came, was small but steady. He didn't ask where he was or what had happened, only whispered a few words that none of the adults knew how to process. He was big, he said, his gaze fixed on the ceiling of the ambulance. And his eyes were kind. The words hung in the sterile air like something sacred and untouchable. One of the medics, a man who had worked disasters for 20 years, later told investigators that the tone of the boy's voice unnerved him more than the fire itself. It wasn't the voice of a frightened child recalling a nightmare. It was the voice of someone remembering a protector. At the hospital, doctors examined him again and confirmed what the rescuers had already noticed. The boy should have been severely burned. The temperatures in that fire had reached levels that could melt aluminum, yet his skin was cool to the touch, his lungs clear. The only marks were faint red lines across his arms. Pressure lines, they said, as though something large had held him tightly to its chest. News of his miraculous survival spread quickly through the small town. Neighbors came to the hospital with casseroles, blankets, prayers, and theories. Some called it divine intervention. Others spoke of miracles. But among the firefighters and the scientists who had seen the footage, no one said those words aloud. They all thought of the same impossible figure moving through the flames, the creature that had carried the boy from the fire without fear or hesitation. Evan didn't speak much in the following days. He spent most of his time staring out the hospital window, where the smoke from the ruined forest still drifted over the horizon. When someone asked him again what he remembered, he hesitated before answering, not as if he were uncertain, but as if he were deciding how much truth the adults could handle. Finally, he turned his head toward the glass, watching the trees sway in the cold wind. "He didn't run from the fire," he said softly. "He came from the forest." And with that, the boy closed his eyes, leaving the room heavy with silence, the kind that comes when the impossible suddenly feels too real to deny. By morning, the fire was finally dead, not extinguished by man, but by exhaustion. The land lay still beneath a gray sky, its silence broken only by the hiss of steam rising from charred timber. What had once been the Miller family home was now a skeleton of blackened logs and twisted metal, still warm to the touch even as frost began to settle along the ashes. The scent of wet smoke clung to everything: the ground, the firefighters' jackets, the air itself. The cleanup team moved slowly through the wreckage, turning over beams, checking for embers, their boots sinking into soft, soot-darkened earth. The place where the boy had been found lay untouched, a patch of trampled grass that looked almost peaceful amid the devastation. Beyond it, the yard faded into the woods, an unbroken wall of pine shrouded in pale fog that carried the faint sweetness of burning resin. One of the younger firefighters, exhausted but alert, was the first to notice something strange near the edge of the clearing. At first, he thought the marks in the dirt were the result of falling debris or warped boards, but as he crouched down, brushing away the ash with a gloved hand, the shape beneath became unmistakable. A footprint pressed deep into the mud, larger than any human could leave. It was long, wide, and perfectly defined, with 5 distinct toes and an arch heavy enough to suggest enormous weight. He called the others over, and soon a small circle of men gathered, staring down at the imprint as if it were something sacred. The more they looked, the less sense it made. The prints were too clear to be coincidence, too deliberate, too purposeful. They began to follow them, moving carefully so as not to disturb the pattern. Each step stretched almost 2 meters apart, the stride impossibly long and steady, as though whoever made them had walked calmly away from the ruins without so much as glancing back. The trail wound past the broken fence, across the damp earth, and into the woods where the fog thickened, swallowing the final impressions whole. No drag marks, no bent branches, no signs of hesitation. Just the clean rhythm of heavy footsteps fading into wilderness. One of the men took out his phone, trying to capture the sight before it vanished beneath the settling mist, but the lens fogged instantly from the humidity. The only usable photos were the plaster casts they made later that afternoon, casts that showed details no prank or hoax could replicate. The proportions were all wrong, the heel broader than a shovel blade, the toes splayed naturally, the weight distribution perfectly balanced. Not costume shoes, not carved boards, real impressions left by something with mass and motion. The chief of the fire crew, a man who had seen his share of strange accidents, stood silently at the forest's edge, looking down at the last footprint before it disappeared into the undergrowth. The woods were quiet, unnervingly so, as if they too were holding their breath. He didn't say anything to the men beside him, but later, when the reports were filed, he added one short note at the bottom of the page, written in the same steady handwriting he used for every official document. Large unknown bipedal prints found leading west into forest. Source unconfirmed. Direction consistent with movement away from fire zone. That was all. No mention of size, no mention of the photographs, no mention of the boys' words or the footage they all pretended not to have seen. But among those who were there that morning, no one ever forgot the sound their boots made when they stepped beside those prints. The subtle creak of damp earth giving way to something deeper, something older than the forest itself. The discovery of the footprints drew more than just curiosity. It summoned quiet dread. Within hours, the site was surrounded by officials from the local forestry service, their green trucks parked along the scorched perimeter of the property. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, and yet the soil beneath the prints still looked damp, almost pliable, as if it had been stepped on moments ago. The trackers moved methodically, laying rulers beside each indentation, photographing them from every angle, whispering to one another in disbelief. They had seen every kind of mark that animals left behind in this region: bear, elk, cougar, but none of those prints looked remotely like these. Each footprint was startlingly clear, showing 5 well-defined toes and a wide arch without any trace of claws. The stride was impossibly even, stretching up the slope toward the northern ridge before stopping abruptly near a cluster of rocks. The men followed the trail carefully, documenting each step as the fog began to close in around them, and then, without warning, the tracks ended. Not faded, ended. The last print was half pressed into the soft earth at the edge of the ridge, the next step simply gone, as if the creature had walked straight into the air and vanished. The head ranger, a stoic man who'd spent 20 years in these woods, stood at the edge, staring into the emptiness ahead. There were no drag marks, no broken twigs, no evidence of retreat. The forest floor was untouched beyond that final print. He said nothing to his team but quietly marked the coordinates on his map before ordering everyone back to camp. Later, when questioned by reporters, he said only, "Whatever made those tracks wasn't trying to hide. It just stopped being here." That evening, long after the sun sank and the mist swallowed the last glow of the valley, the forest began to make its own kind of noise. Residents from nearby homes along the ridge reported strange sounds coming from the direction of the burn site. At first it was faint, low, rhythmic thuds that could have been trees settling in the cold, but then came a deep humming tone that seemed to roll through the air, resonating like the echo of something vast and hollow. It wasn't mechanical, nor was it quite animal. It was somewhere in between, something living yet not of the known world. Dogs began to howl across the valley, but none of them ventured near the tree line. One family reported that their shepherd pressed itself against the back door, trembling and whining, refusing to go outside even when called. Another said the lights in their barn flickered each time the sound returned. The power company found no faults. Among the firefighters who had remained to guard the site, one later broke his silence in an interview that was never meant to be public. He described standing at the edge of the clearing just after midnight, the moonlight faint through the drifting smoke, when the low hum returned, this time closer. "It wasn't just sound," he said. "You could feel it, like it came through your chest instead of your ears." He paused before adding the part that unsettled him the most. "When I looked up toward the trees, I saw a figure, tall, unmoving. I thought it was one of the rangers until I noticed the eyes. They weren't reflecting light. They were giving it off." He claimed the figure stood there for several seconds before turning and melting into the fog, leaving the woods eerily silent, as if even the wind had stopped to listen. No one else that night admitted to seeing anything, but nearly everyone agreed on one detail. For a brief moment, the forest didn't feel empty. It felt aware, like it was watching back. By dawn, the sound had faded, but those who heard it swore they could still feel it vibrating in their bones, as though the forest itself had tried to speak, and humanity had no words to answer. The video did not stay within the walls of the fire department for long. Within a week, it had found its way to the university, quietly, through channels not listed in any official report. In a dimly lit laboratory, far from the noise of the press, 3 professors from the Department of Human Biomechanics gathered to study the footage that local authorities couldn't explain. They were men accustomed to analyzing gait, posture, and muscle dynamics, people who could look at a shadow and tell you if it walked like a man or a machine. When the frames began to play, none of them spoke for a long time. They watched the figure emerge from the flames, its movements slowed to 1/10 of real speed. Every shift of weight, every swing of the arm was captured in perfect clarity. One of the scientists, a specialist in joint articulation, leaned forward as the creature turned slightly toward the camera, carrying the child in its arms. He noted the angle of the shoulders, the rotation of the hips, and the distribution of mass across the back. It all defied what he called the human envelope, the natural limits of skeletal motion. The arms were far too long for the proportions of a man. The torso moved with a seamless rhythm, like a pendulum guided by instinct rather than thought. Another expert analyzed the stride and velocity. By his calculation, the being's steps were nearly 2 meters apart, yet the body never lurched or staggered. Its balance was perfect, even as it carried the child. The creature's head remained level, the motion fluid, as if each movement was synchronized with the environment around it. No human, the third researcher said finally, walks with that kind of unconscious precision, not through fire, not while carrying weight. They compared the footage against countless recordings of human subjects in protective suits, athletes, soldiers, anyone whose body had been pushed to extremes. Every comparison failed, but what struck them most wasn't the anatomy. It was the composure. The creature didn't appear frantic or afraid. Its posture, even under the strain of the heat and the burden it carried, was measured, steady, almost serene. It wasn't running from the fire, it was moving through it. When one of the professors stopped the frame on the exact moment the creature glanced toward the camera, the room fell silent. Its eyes, faint and amber even through the haze, reflected no panic, only awareness. One of the scientists, older and slower to speak, finally murmured what the others were thinking. It doesn't move like an actor in a suit. It moves like part of the forest, something that was never pretending to be human in the first place. The footage was stored, encrypted, and sent for further review. Officially, the university made no statement. Unofficially, no one in that lab forgot what they'd seen. One assistant later confided to a journalist that the team's written report had been quietly sealed and archived. No copy was ever found again. A few days later, as the investigation at the burn site continued, one of the fire captains, John Grady, the first man to enter the burning house, gave a private account of something that had unsettled him since that night. He described entering through what was left of the kitchen, his boots crunching across collapsing tiles, the air thick with smoke so dense it stung the eyes. The walls radiated heat like a furnace, and yet amid the chaos, he noticed something odd on the floor near the child's bedroom. There, in the soot and ash, was a dark patch of soil, damp, heavy, and unmistakably fresh. Grady crouched down, pressed his glove to it, and felt the coolness of real earth, not residue from the fire. But there had been no rain for nearly 2 weeks. The ground outside was frozen solid, the soil inside should have been bone dry. The patch led from the doorway to the center of the room and back again, as though someone, or something, had walked in and out carrying weight. Beside it lay a fragment of spruce bark, still green beneath its singed edge. When he lifted it, water dripped from the underside. He stood there, surrounded by a burning house, holding a piece of living forest that had no right to exist there. For a moment he thought he heard something faint beneath the roar of the flames, a deep, distant sound, like wind moving through trees. He never mentioned the bark in his official report. It didn't fit anywhere in the paperwork. But that night, long after the others had gone home, he drove back to the site and buried the fragment near the tree line, telling no one. Later, when asked why, he simply said, "It didn't belong in a house. It belonged where it came from." A week after the incident, when the ash had begun to fade beneath a light dusting of snow, a local farmer from the neighboring valley came forward with a story that at first sounded too strange to be taken seriously. His name was Albert Crowley, a man who had lived alone on his small property for most of his life, tending to his cattle and keeping mostly to himself. He wasn't one for gossip, nor was he known for wild imagination. But that night, as he told the sheriff later, something had walked across the edge of his field that wasn't supposed to exist. Albert had been checking on his livestock after the sky turned red from the wildfire. From his porch, he could see the distant glow beyond the tree line, the air thick with drifting smoke. The wind carried the faint scent of burning resin and the dry crackle of fire traveling fast through the forest. He stood there listening to it, uneasy but not frightened, until something moved against the light. At first, he thought it was a bear. The silhouette was large, dark, and heavy, walking along the ridge between his property and the forest. But even through the haze, there was something wrong with the way it moved. It didn't sway like a bear does, he said later, describing the figure with slow precision, as if replaying it in his mind frame by frame. It walked straight, not hunched, not crawling, just upright, like a man, but too big for a man. The creature moved with deliberate purpose, each stride long and steady, and though it passed within clear sight, it never once turned its head toward the farmhouse. What struck him most, however, was what it carried, something small, limp, and pale against its dark chest. The wind shifted just then, sweeping the smoke in his direction. Albert caught a whiff of something unexpected, not the bitter, choking scent of fire, but something cool and organic, like the forest after rain. It smelled like wet earth, he told the investigator, his voice lowering to almost a whisper, like pine needles crushed underfoot and the ground right after a storm. It didn't make sense, not with the fire burning less than a mile away. He watched the figure for as long as his nerves allowed, his hand frozen on the railing of his porch. It crossed the ridge with remarkable grace for its size, its steps nearly silent despite the frozen underbrush. In the dim glow from the distant flames, he could see the faint shimmer of moisture clinging to its fur, as though the creature carried the dampness of the woods with it, untouched by heat or smoke. Then it descended toward the valley, vanishing into the fog that hung low over the riverbank. When reporters later pressed him for details, Albert refused to embellish. "People think I made it up," he said, "but I know what I saw. That wasn't no bear, and it wasn't a man. Whatever it was, it walked like it knew where it was going, and it was carrying something it didn't want to lose." His account might have been dismissed entirely, if not for the faint impressions found near the boundary of his property, large human-like footprints in the soft soil, leading from the burned ridge down toward the river. They matched the plaster casts taken from the fire site in both size and shape, and though the local authorities tried to explain them away as overlapping bear tracks, the spacing between them told another story. As for Albert, he stopped keeping his porch light on at night. "Not out of fear," he said to a friend months later, "out of respect." If he ever walks that ridge again, I don't want to blind him with light. He's seen enough fire." Within 48 hours, the video that had shaken the small Montana county vanished from public view. At first, it appeared on a local news site, attached to an article about the mysterious rescue, but by the next morning, the link led nowhere. File unavailable. Then the copies shared across social media began to disappear one by one, replaced with official statements declaring the footage inauthentic. The fire department denied ever releasing it. The sheriff's office claimed the clip was part of an internal training exercise, and university spokesmen called it a misinterpreted simulation. The narrative shifted overnight from wonder to dismissal, and by the end of the week, the event was buried beneath the next headline. But not everyone forgot. One of the younger firefighters, a man named Ray Coleman, had copied the footage before it was confiscated. He had been there that night, had seen the impossible shadow moving through the flames, and couldn't accept the easy explanations. He kept the copy on a flash drive sealed in a weatherproof case, hidden in his desk drawer, until curiosity, or perhaps conscience, got the better of him. Late one evening, weeks after the official investigation closed, he drove 3 towns over to visit an old friend named Hank Larson, a retired member of the State Search and Rescue Division. Hank had spent 30 years in the wilderness, pulling people out of places where no one should have been. He had seen the mountains in every season and had buried enough secrets to recognize when a new one came knocking. When Ray played the video for him, they sat in silence, the blue glow of the laptop screen flickering against their faces. The clip ended, and Hank said nothing for a long time. Then he leaned back in his chair and rubbed a hand across his weathered face. "I've seen that walk before," he said quietly. He told Ray about an incident 10 years earlier, deep in the Bitterroot Range, when a group of hikers went missing after a storm swept through the canyon. The team found the first of them 3 days later, injured but alive, lying beside a riverbank where rescue was nearly impossible. The man claimed he had fallen from the ridge and should have died on impact, but someone had carried him out of the gorge in the dark. He never saw who it was, only remembered being lifted in arms, rough as bark and warm like a living blanket. At the time, Hank and his crew dismissed it as shock. They had chalked up the story to hallucination, the byproduct of fear and cold. But what stayed with him was what they found near the recovery site. Massive footprints pressed into the mud, leading away from the canyon floor and up into the tree line. The tracks ended abruptly at the base of an old cedar, just as the prints near the Miller property had done. Now, watching the creature on Ray's laptop stride calmly through the fire, Hank felt the old unease return. He rewound the video, pausing on the frame where the being looked toward the camera, its shoulders glinting with embers. "That's the same build," he muttered. "Same way it moves, like it belongs here, not like it's trespassing." Ray asked him what he thought it was. Hank stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. "Whatever it is, it's been here longer than we have. It doesn't care about our cameras or our stories or what we call it. It just shows up when it's needed, and then it's gone." He closed the laptop and handed the drive back. "Keep it safe," he said, "and don't try to prove anything. Some truths aren't meant for proof, they're meant for remembering." That night, Ray drove home through the dark mountains, the sky clear and cold. As he passed the turnoff toward the burned valley, a gust of wind swept through the pines, bending them all in one direction. For a moment, he thought he heard something deep in the distance, low, rhythmic, and almost like breathing. Then the sound faded, and the forest returned to its quiet. Months passed before anyone thought to check the old county archives. The fire investigation had closed, the Millers had relocated to stay with relatives, and what remained of the story had faded into the background noise of local rumor. Yet when a young archivist named Laura Bennett began digitizing historical photographs for a community history project, she stumbled across an image that would bring everything back to life. It was a simple family portrait dated July 1974, captured on a square of faded Kodak film. The photo showed a younger generation of millers standing proudly in front of their newly built farmhouse, the same house that would burn nearly half a century later. The picture was mundane at first glance, the father's arm slung around his wife's shoulders, a boy no older than 5 perched on a fence rail, the familiar slope of the forest rising behind them under a clean summer sky. It was a frozen moment of small-town happiness, the kind preserved in shoeboxes and family albums across rural America. But when Laura zoomed in to adjust the resolution, something behind the family caught her attention. Between 2 pine trunks, just beyond the reach of the sunlight, stood a shadow that didn't belong to any tree. She enhanced the image, adjusting contrast, removing glare. The form grew clearer. It was tall, far taller than any man, its outline rough but unmistakably upright. The figure stood in the dimness of the forest, one arm resting against a tree, its head turned slightly toward the camera. Laura stared at the screen, her heart hammering. The longer she looked, the more wrong the scale appeared. The creature was not close to the family. It stood at least 20 meters behind them, yet it rose almost to the height of the lowest branches. When she overlaid a reference grid to measure scale, the figure would have stood more than 2.5 meters tall. No bear, no shadow, no trick of light could account for it. She printed the photo and brought it to her supervisor, who brushed it off at first. "Probably double exposure," he said. But when she explained that the film type used in the 70s couldn't produce a shadow of that density without a secondary light source, his expression shifted. They both knew what property this was. They both knew what had happened there less than a year ago. Word spread quietly among the archivists and historians, and within a week the image was circulating through back channels, the same circles that had studied the fire footage before it disappeared. Each person who examined it reached the same unsettling conclusion. The figure had been there all along, captured on film decades before the fire, long before the world had reason to believe in anything other than coincidence. When the photo was shown to the surviving members of the Miller family, the elderly father took one look and grew pale. "That picture," he said slowly, "was taken the summer we first moved in. I remember that day. It was hot. My father said the forest felt alive, like it was watching us. We laughed about it." He fell silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the faint silhouette behind his younger self. "Guess maybe it was," he whispered finally. The photo was never made public. Officially, it remained archived under Unverified Visual Anomaly, 1974. But among those who saw it, there was no question anymore. The being captured by that camera wasn't a visitor. It hadn't come to the Miller property because of the fire. It had always been there, somewhere between the trees, silent and unseen, watching the same family grow, build, and burn, waiting for the night when it would finally step out of the shadows and act. A month after the fire, when the valley had settled back into its uneasy quiet, Evan began to wake in the middle of the night. His parents at first thought it was the lingering effects of the trauma, the nightmares the doctor had warned them about. But this was different. He didn't scream or cry. He would simply sit upright in bed, listening, his small hand pressed against the window pane, as if feeling for something beyond the glass. When his mother asked what he heard, he would whisper, "The same sound as before." The sound wasn't loud. It was deep and distant, rolling through the air like thunder trapped beneath the earth. Evan said it came from the forest, not from the wind or the animals, but from something in the trees. It wasn't scary, he told them. It just sounded like someone calling, like they wanted me to know they were there. The tone of his voice carried none of the fear one would expect from a child who had been through fire. It was calm, certain, almost reverent. One night when the sound came again, a long, low hum that vibrated against the window, the boy's father finally went outside to prove there was nothing there. The air was sharp with cold, the world around him muffled by snow that reflected the pale light of the moon. He crossed the yard in his boots, the snow crunching softly beneath his weight, and turned his ear toward the woods. For a moment there was only stillness, the kind that holds its breath before revealing what it's hiding. Then he heard it, a single, resonant note, like wind passing through a hollow trunk, low enough to rattle the ribs. He called out once, twice, his voice small against the endless dark. The forest gave no reply. When he walked back toward the house, something caught his eye at the far edge of the yard. 2 footprints pressed deep into the snow stood side by side, too large to be human, too precise to belong to an animal. They faced the woods, not the house, and led nowhere. No entrance, no exit, no trail. Just 2 impressions left, as if someone had paused there, watching before turning away. He stood over them for a long time, the breath from his mouth hanging in the air. By the time he went inside, he had no explanation that would satisfy what he'd seen. He simply told his wife that the forest had gone quiet again. But Evan, half awake, smiled faintly when his father closed the door. "He just wanted to make sure we were okay," the boy murmured, before drifting back to sleep. Years passed. The land where the Miller house once stood healed in its own quiet way. The forest reclaimed the edges first, sending roots through the blackened soil until, by the 3rd spring, grass had begun to grow where the floorboards had been. The scent of ash faded, replaced by the damp sweetness of moss and pine. And though most who drove by would never have guessed that tragedy had once lived there, the locals never forgot. They called it the Green Lot now, the place that burned but would not die. At the roadside, a flat stone marks the spot. The town placed it there as a memorial, the date of the fire etched into its surface. But beneath the inscription, someone had carved a single word in uneven childlike letters: "Thank you." No one ever admitted to writing it, and over the years, people stopped asking. Every autumn, when the first frost touches the valley, someone leaves a small bundle of fresh spruce branches at the base of the stone. No footprints ever accompany the offering, and no one claims to have seen who brings it. The branches are always arranged neatly, tied with twine, their needles still wet with dew as if gathered that morning from deep within the forest. Some say it's an old firefighter paying quiet respects. Others think it's the boy, grown up now, returning each year to honor the night he was saved. But there are those who believe something else, that the forest remembers what the world tried to forget. They say that whatever walked out of the fire that night never left entirely. It remained somewhere among the trees, watching over the clearing where the house once stood, keeping its silent vigil. And though no one has seen it since, the people who live near the valley speak softly when the wind blows through the pines. Because every so often, when the nights grow cold and the world holds still enough to listen, that same low voice can be heard again, carried through the branches, gentle, almost human. A reminder that not everything that comes from the dark means harm. Some things, even the strangest of them, come only to protect.